Hello students, a very good morning to you all. Today we are going to discuss about the second part of the third chapter in geography in 7th standard, that is tides. In the previous video we have seen or we have discussed about the different tides, how the centrifugal and gravitational force are attracting towards the south pole and north pole, and what are the situation that surface of the earth remains at the place where it exists. So now we will discuss about the different tides. Now there are some responsible of occurrence of tides. We'll see the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun as well as that of the earth. So there is a gravitational pull, there is a gravitational force that the sun as well as the earth are having towards the tides. So because of that, tides are having low tides and high tides. So this is one of the main occurrence of tides, so that is the responsible of that. Next we will see revolution of the earth around the sun and the indirect revolution of the moon around the sun. Students, as you all know that around the earth the sun revolves and it is in the indirect revolution of this around the sun. When it's revolving around the sun or around the earth, the high tide and low tide take place. Next is centrifugal force generated due to rotation of the earth. So centrifugal का जो force है वो किसकी वजह से generate होता है? Because of the rotation of the earth. Means वो चारों तरफ क्या करता है, उसको rotate करते रहता है. Means it is rotating towards the north pole, and because of that what happened? The occurrence of tide is taking place. Can you see the diagram? When you see the gravitational force is coming toward the opposite side. Means over there what you will find, over there you will find the high tide, but when it is moving to the right hand side, over there also you will see, over there you will see centrifugal force. Centrifugal force is the thing where the high tide is also taking place, but where the high tide is taking place means over there the low tide will also take. There will be the north pole when the pressure of the water will not be more. So that we call as gravitational force and centrifugal force, and that cycle which is there on page number 11, figure 3.6, that will be called as the occurrence of tide. Occurrence of tide means कैसे different tides and because of the gravitational force are coming. So this is the occurrence of tide. The moon is closer to the earth, as we all know that moon is very closer to the earth and it is revolving with the earth. Hence its gravitational force becomes more effective than that of the sun. So the gravitational force is there, that is more effective when it comes near to the sun. Tides occur due to the relative position of the moon. So tide occurs because of the relative position of the moon. Because of the moon is changing the direction, because of that only the tide is occurring. A place on the earth located at the opposite point of the place experiencing high tide or low tide also experience high or low tides respectively at the same time. So students, as you all know, when you are having low tide means when low tide is there, automatically the water pressure will be low, but when it is high tide you will feel the coast which is there nearby you will be finding over there will be more water. वहाँ पे water का pressure ज़्यादा होता है. Why? Because of high tide. As we have discussed on the very first part of the video, that why the low tide is coming, because of the pressure of more water. Why the low tide is taking place? Why? Because there is no pressure of water, and you will see there are different tsunamis. Tsunamis is also taking place. Why tsunamis is taking place? Because of the high tide. As in the news also we have seen, when there is heavy rainfall and the government is declaring that in your area or in the coastal area you are having high tide. Over there you can't walk, over there you can't go. So there, that area, a particular area will be having a high tide area, and that area will be in alert position. So that because of the high tide. This is a result of centrifugal force. So why this has happened? Because of the cycle of centrifugal force. And try to understand the location of high and low tide on the earth. So there are two facts is given. When there is high tide at 0 degree meridian, the 180 meridian also experience high tide. So when you are having a meridian lines, so meridian lines of 180 degree, that area of the meridian, means that line is going, a longitude line is going over there, also you will find a high tide, means experiencing of that high tide. Next is the meridians that are at a right angles to those having high tide will experience low tide at the same time. So when you are having the meridian at 180 degree of right angles, that angles you will have a 180 degree of meridians and even 0 degree meridians at the same time. At the same time you will experience the high tide of that area. So this is how the meridian of low tide occurs. Now we'll see the types of tides. So what are the different types of tides we are occurring? So first we will see the spring tide, but let us discuss the deep information. As the timing of the tides varies every day, so the timing of the tides varies every day because it keeps changing, वो change होते रहता है, and because of changing you are having different types of tide. Take the example, when you are at the night you will see your seaside or your where you are having sea face, over there you will find there is no more pressure of the water, but when you see the morning you will see the water pressure is more because of the high tide, because it keeps changing, वो हर दिन change होते रहता है. Because of that cycle we are having different types of tides. Generally, the highest high tide occurs on full moon and new moon day, whereas on the moon day of the first and the third quarter, the high tide is at minimum. Spring tides and neap tide are the two types of tides. So we are going to discuss about spring tides and neap tides. So students, when the highest high tide occurs, because it is occurring because of the full moon and new moon day, when these two types of moon day is there, you are experiencing the high tide. But because of the first and third quarter, you are also having what you are having. You are having spring tide and neap tide of a area. So the first is neap tide. On the new moon and full moon days, the gravitational pull of the sun and the sun act in the same direction. Due to this, the total pull increases. So on a new moon and full moon day, the gravitational pull from the sun and the moon act in the same direction, means they are rotating around itself only. So obviously when they are rotating around the self, वो एक ही place पे rotate करे at the same direction, means the direction is not changing by them. Due to this, the total pull increases, hence the tide on these days is much higher than the average high tide. This is known as a spring tide. So when the high tide is much higher than the average of high, means बहुत ज़्यादा pressure आ रहा है high tide का, so that will be called as a spring tide. As the bulge at the high tide is greater, bulge means at the greater, means large, the water at low tide records much more. The water level during spring tide is higher than the average high tide and lower than the average low. So the water level means during the spring tide is higher than the average high tides, means जब spring tide होता है, over there you will find the water level, means water का जो pressure होता है वो बहुत कम होता है, because there is a high tide, but then also the water pressure is low as compared to the high tide, but it is there in the spring tide. Spring tide में ये होता है सब. So can you see the diagram? Diagram is having a accumulate of spring tide of measurement. So that is the level of the water actually is given in the form of high tide. But when you see the north pole of the earth, means earth and the sun, earth and moon, they are rotating around itself, but there are some cycles which are moving to the spring tide. It is given the level of high tide also, but at the same time you are also having high tide and low tide. So that low tide and high tide, it is having a spring tide actually we called, and it is happening because of the new moon day and full moon day. Because of that we also have a gravitational force. Next moving, that is a neap tide. While revolving around the earth, the moon makes a right angle with respect to the earth and the sun twice a month. So in a twice a month we are having what right angle to the earth and the sun. This position occur on the first and the third quarter of each month. So because of the quarter of each month we are having first and third moon. On these days the forces of both the sun and the moon operate at right angles on the earth. So because of these days, we are having sun and the moon at the right angles on the earth, means we are having at the right angle direction. At the place where the sun causes higher tide, the gravitational pull of the moon, which is at right angle, also act on the sea water. So when the gravitational pull is there on the moon, we are also having right angle, and that right angle is also acting in the sea water. Because of the right angle, we are also having sea water pressure. Due to such condition, the water level rise is less than unusual at the same of high tide. Similarly, fall in water wall is less than unusual at the same time of low tide. This is because the attraction of the sun and the moon are not in complementary but at the right angle to each other. Such tides are called neap tides. So when the attraction of the sun and the moon are not complementary, means अगर एक साथ में वो अगर नहीं attract हो रहे, so that will be called as a neap tide. Neap tides are a little lower than the average of high tide. So जो high tide होता है उसका एक part है, so that will be called as a neap tide. But neap tide, when you are having, means it is not at the high pressure, it will be at the lower pressure. So neap tide से अगर compare करेंगे spring tide को, so over there you will find there is a more pressure of spring tide and neap tide is having low pressure as compared to both. Now you can see the diagram. So in neap tide also the same diagram given, but we have to assume कि when the low tide is taking place and when the neap tide is when the high tide is taking place. So we have seen the two types, that is two tide, neap tide and spring tides. So neap tide is also the same, but the pressure of the water is accumulated less as compared to the spring tides. And we are having same level of high tides, and we are also having North Pole and the earth where it's rotating. So this is the explanation of neap tide and spring tides. In the next video we will see the effects of videos.